Incarceration is the great destroyer. This country needs to reform their policies. What if we could invest in the people that we wrote off to get a return of public safety? I spent the span of 27 consecutive years in prison. During that time, I religiously reformed myself through self-study, self-help books, and faith. During my tenure of incarceration, I was able to obtain a very unique space in history in Washington, D.C. I became the first person who was elected as an official while I was incarcerated. We have empirical data that highlights emphatically that an individual can age out of crime. So if you have an emerging adult, 18 years of age, 20 years, now that person is 38, he or she 9 times out of 10 is no longer thinking like he or she once thought when they were 18. This is a good time to have a second look for everyone. But if you're coming out the gate sentencing a young person, or anyone for that matter, to 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, that's absurd. That's absurd. Here we are, we supposed to be the citadel of civilization, democracy, and all those other beautiful sounding words that we like to say about the United States of America. However, we treat our most vulnerable population worse than the people we call our enemies. So we want to be serious about uplifting the humanity of all people. We have to start right there. We have 50 years of data that proves to us emphatically that the old way of doing things no longer works. It never worked. Let's change it. Wake up.
Hello and welcome. My name is Kara Gotch and I'm the Executive Director of the Sentencing Project, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to the Marc Racial Justice Awards. Thank you for coming. That video you just watched was part of a national public education campaign that we launched to educate people about the impact of mass incarceration 50 years after its onset in 1973. It aired in millions of homes across the country over the last year as a public service announcement. And it was a really exciting opportunity for us to get in front of audiences that don't often hear the message of the harm of mass incarceration, and promote and the need for promoting change in our system of the criminal legal system. I'm also proud that the film featured a very good friend and partner of the Sentencing Project, Joel Castone. Joel is a leader in Washington, D.C. and across the nation on sentencing reform issues and voting rights for people who are system impacted. We advocated last year with the D.C. Council to create a position on the Sentencing Commission for someone who is formerly incarcerated to have a seat at the table in helping to make decisions around sentencing guidelines that informed judges' decisions in D.C. We were very pleased that the D.C. Council accepted our recommendation, and this year Joel was appointed as the Sentencing Commission's first formerly incarcerated member of the D.C. Sentencing Commission. It's an important contribution that he's going to be making that will make the decisions more of the commission, the Sentencing Commission, more impactful and more understandable and the experience of those who are incarcerated in the District of Columbia. We are also took that work nationally and hosted a panel discussion at the National Conference on State Sentencing Commissions, where Joel came and spoke about his experience as a commissioner, and other commissioners in other states who are formerly incarcerated talked about their service on sentencing commissions and the role that they have to play. We're hoping that more people who are formerly incarcerated will have active roles in setting policy around sentencing reform, and we're playing a small part in trying to change the system. We know that when government is more representative of the people, including people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds and experiences, including people who are formerly incarcerated. The legitimacy of government and the policies enacted increase, and our government becomes better. So that's just one example of how the Sentencing Project is really prioritizing and informing our leadership with those voices who are directly impacted. I'm just so proud that we can be part of that. And it's also why I'm so excited for today's event. I'm so happy that we have been able to honor today Sam Lewis and Shaka Senghor, who are two individuals who have served life sentences in the United States and have used their experiences to be fierce advocates for meaningful reform in this country. I know we're going to have a really vibrant and excellent conversation that will inspire you as much as I know it will me. I now want to turn the mic over to the Sentencing Project's board president, Henderson Hill, who's going to speak more about the Marc Mauer Award and its origination. It's a special initiative of our board of directors. And I also want to thank Henderson for his leadership at the Sentencing Project and as a steadfast supporter of this organization. So thank you, Henderson, and I look forward to hearing more from you.
Good afternoon, all. Thank you, Kara, and special greetings to Sam Lewis and to Shaka Senghor. It's a real privilege to represent the project, the Sentencing Project, at this webinar. It's even as great a privilege to follow on that video of Joel Gaston. That's why we do this work. That's why the Sentencing Project exists. This notion of combating mass incarceration, it's not a matter of numbers and statistics and dockets. It's really a way of demonstrating and proving that the current criminal legal system is wrong. It sponsors and maintains a level of oppression on limited communities, on oppressed communities. The statistics are shocking. And thanks to the research, the consistent work of the Sentencing Project, the statistics are increasingly known in broader and broader sections of our community. Today, 1 in 5 Black men are likely to be imprisoned at some point in their lives. What's even more shocking is that number is lower than what it was 15, 20 years ago. And it's lower in part because of the work the Sentencing Project has done to bring to light the racial disparities in our criminal justice system. Notwithstanding efforts, smart on crime efforts, we still have people of color at risk. People of color remain massively overrepresented in prisons. Nearly 7 in 10 people in prison are folks of color. Recent estimates show that 1 in 81 Black adults in the United States is currently serving time in state prison. That is shocking, should be shocking to anyone who hears it. The systemic causes range from a history of racial and ethnic subordination to ongoing police tactics that unfairly ensnare people of color. We know driving while Black is often the entryway into the justice system, but the charging and sentencing policies and practices create stiffer, harsher, more crippling penalties and punishments for people of color. What's the cost of this? This policy inflicts atrocities. And in fact, it prevents the United States from becoming a true democracy. Just look at the current political season, where half the country seems quite comfortable using racial tropes, slurs, more than dog whistles, to show the lasting impact of the white supremacy narrative that still controls so much of not only public discourse, but public policy. Well, the Sentencing Project is guided by a strategic focus on racial justice and a commitment to amplifying the work, voices, and leadership of directly impacted individuals, families, and communities. Our former executive director, and now a member of the board, Marc Maurer, has long been a champion of these issues. In fact, as a young public defender, well, a younger public defender some decades ago, I leaned on the work of our former executive director, Marc Maurer, and the work of the Sentencing Project. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the publication of his seminal work, Race to Incarcerate. That book was critical to the field, encouraged the next generation of defenders, criminal justice reform activists, and policy advocates across the country. Marc's legacy inspired the creation of this award. It should be mentioned that even more recently, Marc and Ashley Nellis, a colleague at the Sentencing Project, made another enormous contribution, the meaning of life. Again, an incredible contribution to the effort to abolish life sentences. On behalf of the Sentencing Project's board, I congratulate Sam Lewis and Shaka Senghor on receiving the Marc Maurer Racial Justice Award. It's my privilege now to introduce and turn the baton over to Marc Maurer.
Well, thank you so much, Henderson. I'm delighted to be here, of course. When the Sentencing Project board created this award in my name, I was quite honored and humbled. At this point, it's just a delight for me to be part of this process of honoring such fabulous awardees. By way of history, this award grows out of the more than 3 decades of work the Sentencing Project has engaged in centering racial justice in the research and advocacy we do, challenging mass incarceration. Back in 1991, we documented that nearly 1 in 4 young Black men was under some form of criminal justice supervision on any given day, a very shocking figure. We were hardly the first to recognize racism in the justice system, but what we could do by putting a number on it was to help to gain broad attention from the public and policymakers to the issue. Since that time, along with many other allies, we've continued to call attention to the wide-ranging impact of mass incarceration on communities of color in our advocacy campaigns to change public policy. Now, this has included longstanding efforts to elevate and challenge the crack cocaine sentencing disparity at the federal level. It took nearly a quarter century to finally get reform enacted in the year 2010. We've also documented the broad attack on the democracy brought about by felony disenfranchisement laws, which in 48 states restrict people with a current or previous felony conviction from entering the voting booth. At its peak, more than 6 million people were disenfranchised because of a current or prior felony conviction. Now, the good news here is that because of sustained advocacy around the country, half the states have since adopted reforms to these policies to scale back the dramatic impact of these laws. In recent years, we've also been engaged in looking at the terrible problem of extreme sentencing in this country, and particularly the world record rate at which people are sentenced to life imprisonment. Here too, along with many allies, we're encouraged to see the promotion, development of second look policies that are attempting to get courts and correction systems to recognize the changes people undergo and to reconsider some of these extremely harsh sentences. Now, all of this brings me around to Sam Lewis. I first got to know Sam from a distance. About a decade ago, there was a wonderful documentary made called In an Ideal World. And the documentary featured Sam and other men in Soledad Prison in California, focusing largely on anti-violence programming that they were leading to reduce the scale of violence, both inside the prison and think about the outside world as well. Sam had ended up there. He grew up in challenging circumstances in Los Angeles. In his teenage years, joined a gang at the age of 18, was convicted of a gang-related homicide, and then sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. During his time in prison, in addition to the anti-violence work, Sam and others helped to start self-help groups in the prison. He obtained a paralegal degree. He worked to support other guys in their legal arguments they were trying to make, a whole range of activities, both personally transformational and also aiding life inside. Finally, after 24 years, Sam was granted parole release. And I should note that the parole release came on his 9th time before the parole board, before this finally came about. Since Sam has been out, he now is the director of the Anti-Recidivism Coalition in LA, a fabulous organization that's engaged in a wide range of programming, both on the inside and in the community. So one of their initiatives first involved 9 former lifers going back into prison in California, working with men who were coming up for parole consideration, and of those who were successful, aiding in their reentry as they came back into the community. In the area of juveniles, the organization has a credible messenger mentoring program where people go into the juvenile institution, encourage young people to take advantage of educational opportunities, and encouraging them to believe in themselves, to believe that they can have a future. Sam and I connected several years ago when Ashley Nellis, my colleague Henderson, mentioned we were writing our book, The Meaning of Life, about life imprisonment. Now, we were making a largely data-driven, research-based argument for why we think that life imprisonment is counterproductive, but we also recognize that it's important to humanize the issue and the problem, that we need to tell the stories of people serving who have served life sentences, as well as their families and loved ones and the impact on them as well. And Sam was gracious enough to allow us to interview him, to tell his story in the book, along with that of others. And I think the combination of the research argument and the human argument, the compassion argument, is what really made for a compelling presentation there. Among Sam's many accomplishments, there's one in particular last year that I think is truly unique and pretty remarkable. In the year 2023, Sam received an expungement of his criminal conviction from the state of California, recognizing the contributions he has made to his community and the transformation he has undergone. And I can assure you there are not too many former lifers who've been able to gain an expungement of a criminal conviction, and it's quite an accomplishment. Let me just say on a personal basis, Sam Lewis is a kind, generous, and compassionate human being. I very much value having him as a friend and a colleague, and extend my warm congratulations to him on this wonderful honor today. Thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you, Mark. I'm when I was told that I was being considered for this award, I'm a little emotional because Marc, though I've never told him this, I'll say it for everybody. Marc was one of my early heroes in my readings. Race to Incarcerate was one of the books that I read while I was incarcerated. And then when I had a chance to meet him and talk to him, this was 2015, if I recall correctly, just talking with him about what he was working on and his experience over the years. And it solidified one of the things that I knew I wanted to do before I was released, which was change how the system worked. Help young people like myself that find themselves in dire circumstances or that put themselves there by making bad choices, but come out of circumstances that are not particularly great. And so I want to just thank the Sentencing Project, the Board of the Sentencing Project, and Marc Mauer. If you can look behind my shoulder right here, the award is right there. Definitely want this amazing award to be somewhere where it's always visible. And you can't see all of my books, but of course, The Meaning of Life, and one of my other favorite books by my brother Shaka, Letters to the Sons of Society. I first met Shaka in around 2016, 2017. We were on a Summit at the Sea cruise. It was a justice cruise that had a lot of what I called heavy hitters. I was still kind of young in my career, not in age, but in my career. And Shaka was one of the speakers. And he talked about his journey through incarceration into becoming a best-selling author with his first book, Righting My Wrongs. And I listened to him and I was like, this brother's story is just like mine, or mine is just like his. And then I had the opportunity to meet him. And then some years later in 2018, he became the second executive director of ARC, the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, the organization that I now have the privilege of leading. And I learned so much from him, and I watched Shaka do some incredible things in terms of how he put people together, but also how his reading in his books inside facilities. Like, we would go into juvenile facilities and we would pass out his books, or some of the young people would already have read his books or his book at that time, and how he engaged with them and encouraged them to be writers. Shaka's books sit on my bookshelf along with people like Claude Brown and Richard Wright and Marc Mauer. And so I think he's one of those great writers that will be in history for many, many years after we are gone, that continue to change the trajectory of what race is or how race is considered in our country. And so I want to ask this brother, Shaka, if he could say a few words. My brother from another mother, and a guy that does so much work, often behind the scenes, Shaka Senghor.
Man, thank you so much for that warm introduction and warm welcome. And I'm truly honored to be a recipient of this incredible award that really, symbolically acknowledges the incredible work that we've been able to do over the years. And just a little bit of context about my story. I grew up in the city of Detroit in the height of the crack cocaine era. I was a 13-year-old kid when I ran away from an abusive home. And I was an honor roll scholarship student with dreams of being a doctor. And instead, I just found myself seduced into the crack cocaine trade, where I remained for several years. When I was 17 years old, I got shot multiple times standing on the corner of my block. And I think this story illustrates why this work around racial justice is so important, because I know what happened to me in the hospital would not have happened if I would not have been just another Black kid in Detroit who was a victim of gun violence. But after I got shot, I was patched up and sent back to my neighborhood. There was no therapist, no social worker, no psychiatrist, no psychologist who ever thought to ask me, how did I feel? And so as a 17-year-old kid, I went back to my neighborhood with high levels of trauma. And sadly and unfortunately, that trauma carried over into my actions, which led to me tragically causing a man's death 16 months later. I was sentenced to 17 to 40 years in prison. I ended up serving 19 years. 7 of those years was in solitary confinement. And it was in that environment where I began my journey as a writer, because I realized I had never accomplished anything in my life. And writing a book was a symbolic gesture of transformation. If I can complete this one thing, I could completely turn my life around. Got out of prison, hustled books out of the trunk of the car. And what really led to me being in this work at the level that I have grown to be in this work was something that would happen when I would go speak to schools. The administrators would always say, "You don't sound like someone who's been in prison." And I know that they meant that as the best compliment, but what it signaled to me was that society doesn't know who's actually in prison. Prior to the age that we live in now, prison was a very clandestine environment where little was known other than the fear-based narratives that was pushed by politicians during election time. And what I knew was that some of our greatest geniuses are hidden away in prison, some who went in as kids. I was 1 month into my 19th birthday. I spent time at the Michigan Reformatory where, there were young men as young as 16 serving life sentences. Michigan has some of the most aggressive laws when it comes to juveniles who are sentenced as life. But that was the impetus for why I decided to write the book, Righting My Wrongs, because I really wanted people to understand how so many of us ended up in prison, that we weren't, bad people. We were kids who made poor decisions based on a lot of circumstances: PTSD, environmental trauma, systemic racism within the school system, etc. And that book ended up becoming a launching pad for the ideas that I have about humanizing people who are in the system. What our systems have done historically has othered people. If we can, make Black people the villain in the America story, then it's easy to justify arresting them, incarcerating them at unparalleled numbers, and completely diminishing their contributions to society. And I wanted to change that. And so I wrote this book that's going on to have its own journey. I went on to do a TED Talk in 2014 that was the first time that someone who was found guilty of a crime was on that platform. And that talk went on to inform the way that we approach policy, the way that we approach humanization. As a good friend of mine, Van Jones, often said, is we can't do legislation without humanization. And so to be able to contribute to this work as a writer, as a speaker, as a storyteller, it's something I'm extremely proud of and truly honored to be a recipient of this award and to continue to tell the stories that matter. The work that Marc has done and the Census Project has done is, incredible. Because what you all are doing is making conversations that normally are only spoken of in quiet back rooms. You're bringing that to the forefront of society, and by acknowledging Sam and I's contribution, it's special to be two system impacted people, who come from some of the harshest of conditions, and to know that we're here today where our work is helping other people see the value in all of our, family members who are incarcerated. It's truly the biggest honor. So thank you all for having me here today. And I look forward to us diving into the conversation. And it's the biggest honor. And Sam, again, thank you for your leadership. When I handed the baton off, I knew that ARC was in, good hands. But more importantly, I knew that the world was in good hands, because I know that the stories that you're telling and the work that you're doing is really leading us in the right direction. So thank you again for nominating me, and thank you all for joining. And I'm looking forward to, having a robust conversation on this call.
Well, thank you, Shaka, and thank you, Sam. I'm going to invite Sam to turn his camera on. We're going to have a discussion now. One thing I want to say that makes this webinar so special for me and for the Sensing Project is because it's about celebration. Often, we are a research organization that documents problem after problem for many, many decades, but this is an opportunity for us to celebrate our friends and our colleagues. And as Shaka says, it's so important for us to talk about people. And because it's people who change hearts and minds and policy at the end of the day. It's not going to be the numbers. It's going to be about the people who are impacted, who are leading us through this fight and really going to make the difference at the end of the day. So thank you both for being here. And I hope, I know we're going to have a really great discussion. So one thing occurred to me, given both of your affiliation with ARC as the leaders of the organization, could you just give a quick summary for the folks who aren't familiar with the Anti-Recidivism Coalition? What is it ARC is known for? What do you all do?
Thank you. So our mission is to end mass incarceration in California, but also nationally. And so we work in 3 areas currently. One is policy reform. We've now passed 40 pieces of legislation in coalition with other organizations, but led on these 40 pieces of legislation, including voting rights for people that are on parole, including the expungement bill, in which I had my record expunged under, and a plethora of others, such as ending life without the possibility of parole for juveniles and Miranda rights for juveniles. The second area that we work in is rehabilitative programming inside facilities. And so we have, as Marc mentioned, the Hope and Redemption team, a team of former life prisoners that are trained in facilitation of dialectical behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral interventions, and other curriculums that we've developed that helped us transition out of incarceration and thrive while in society. And so there are now 29 Hope and Redemption life coaches in all of the prisons in the state of California. We also do credible messenger mentoring in Pine Grove Fire Camp up in Northern California, Barry J. Nightoff Secure Youth Treatment Facility, and Grawlersburg Youth Fire Camp. And so these are also formerly incarcerated men and women who provide coaching, mentoring, and guidance for our younger brothers that are currently incarcerated and sisters that are currently incarcerated. And then the third area is reentry, where we really have what you call wraparound services. And so we offer housing that includes free therapy for every single member that comes to our organization, whether in our housing or not. True career pathways. We've now placed close to 400 people in the LA and Orange County building trades, union jobs, and careers. We've expanded that program now to include Sacramento surrounding counties and Riverside and San Bernardino counties, with the goal of lifting people out of poverty and breaking that cycle, because we believe that poverty is a driver of both crime and incarceration. We also have a pathway that we created, the first ever firefighters program, where people that have been incarcerated become firefighters. And so right now, California is in the midst of fire season. And these are men and women that are putting their lives on the line, that have been incarcerated previously and now are full-fledged either Cal Wildland firefighters or firefighters in different counties throughout the state. We have a number of other programs that support all of reentry, including things that are fun. We do this river rafting event that just builds community. As you have time, please take a look at our website. Our goal ultimately is to change the number of people that are incarcerated. And in coalition, again, if you think about it, California is at the 50% mark. And what I mean by that is, we were at 178,000 people in prison at one time. Now we have about 92,000 people in prison. Still far too many people to be incarcerated.
That is an impressive agenda, Sam. And what I think is particularly unique about the Anti-Recidivism Coalition is this intersection between direct services and policy. And to be able to take on both areas of that, your organization does both things, is really unusual and amazing. And so I'm sure you keep very busy. All of you keep very busy. So that's really wonderful. And thanks for that description. California, in many ways, is a trend center for the country, both positively and negatively in the criminal legal reform space, right? There's this long legacy of, you know, leading the country on 3 strikes and you're out policies, the real sort of deep end. I mean, it's a state that still has, despite numerous ballot initiatives, attempt to end the death penalty and has not successfully been able to do that. While there's a moratorium, you know, it's still on the books, right? But at the same time has passed really progressive reforms that many people across the country seek to model. I was talking with advocates from Illinois a couple weeks ago who see themselves as really at the forefront of trying to push more humane and effective criminal justice reforms, and pointed to California as, well, what has California done? What could we do, right? But we are, in the last year or so, have been in a really different political environment than I think we've seen in the previous 10, right? Where there's a lot of backlash against reform initiatives and questioning from policymakers about the movement to end mass incarceration. And California is also experiencing this sort of questioning around from policymakers about the reform history. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you all have been seeing in California and nationally in response to this backlash to criminal justice reform, both from the media and politicians.
Yeah, I would love to speak to the more of the national conversation. You know, sadly, whenever we are in a political cycle, you know, we're always confronted with the reality of how our politicians going to show up when it comes to this key issue. And oftentimes they'll lean into fear-based narratives, which has been very common. And we have made some incredible ground, you know, a few years ago at the end of the Obama administration, during the Trump administration. You know, we worked hard to really get the First Step Act passed. We met with some resistance from even some of our allies because they didn't think that the bill went far enough, but, you know, we reinforced the idea that this is the first step. And, you know, in order to get to the outcomes that we're looking for, we got to get a win under our belt. And now we're starting to see a lot of those policies roll back. We're starting to see a lot of that language, that fear-based language re-enter the conversation, the villainization of people, even in the political space. And this may be unpopular, where, you know, Trump's felonies have been weaponized in a way that isn't going to be harmful necessarily to him, but more harmful for those who actually have felonies and who don't have the resources. So narrative shift is an important part of this conversation. And the way that we have to think about it is, when we're dealing with anybody who's been convicted of a felony, we have a responsibility to lean into the humanity of it all, because ultimately over 90% of people who are system impacted will at some point return to our communities. And we have a choice in how we're welcoming people home. And a lot of that is rooted in the way that we humanize as we legislate. When the opioid crisis hit, we saw a shift in the language around drug addiction. And that shift was largely, you know, changed because the opioid crisis began to impact white America. Whereas with the crack epidemic, you know, young black males in inner cities were the villains in that narrative. And once that began to shift, we started to see more empathy, more compassion, more thoughtful care. And the reality is that should be extended to anybody who's going through addiction. We should be thinking about the humanity that even led them down that path. And so there's tons of work to do on the ground. And I would say our biggest push right now for everybody that's on this call is to ensure that we are lifting up those stories. And this is why this award is so important, is it gives us an opportunity to talk about who we really are as human beings. You know, what we've collectively accomplished over the years is really unheard of and unparalleled, and it would not have happened without allies. You know, Scott Butnick, who's the founder of ARC, you know, Kim Kardashian, whose notoriety has brought attention to these arguments, you know, the Van Jones and Jessica Jacksons of the world, other orgs who have been doing this work for a long time, FAM, Prison Creative Arts Project, being able to lift those narratives up as we attempt to pass policy is going to be really important, because we've been villainized for so long that, you know, the window we had where we were humanized is starting to close back up. So that means we just all have to double our efforts to really get those stories back out into the world. And so your leadership, Kara, in the Sentencing Project is integral to this fight.
I want to add additionally, like, thank you first and foremost for that, Shaka. Literally right before I joined this presentation, I was on with Air Talk and debating the head of the the District Attorney Association for California, and he described, let me quote him. He said that we're in a humanitarian crisis here with drug issues, with people that are addicted to drugs. And this was the conversation was about Proposition 36. So Proposition 36 looks to roll back Proposition 47, which changed 9 felony wobblers to misdemeanors. It also put so far $816 million back into our communities in the form of treatment, prevention, victim services, a plethora of different things across the state. And each year, this number grows. With the rollback of this, if Prop 36 passes, we would see a $10 billion increase in incarceration. The number of people will go back up that are incarcerated. But more importantly, he described it as a humanitarian crisis, and I asked him, and he didn't answer. So your answer to this humanitarian crisis is not treatment, but incarceration, because that's literally what we're fighting for right now, is to not have Prop 47 rolled back, and to make sure that young Black and brown kids in the state of California are not sent to jail because they're addicted to drugs. Instead, they need treatment. And so that's literally what we're fighting right now, a rollback of policies that have invested in historically under-resourced communities is now under attack by people that don't live in those communities, simply.
What lesson, I mean, what lessons do you think we've learned? I mean, I think Shaka was, pointing to, telling the stories, and, in response to what you just said, Sam, I'm reflecting on, well, we tried, we did the war on drugs, right? Hundreds of thousands, millions of people over the years have gone to jail, spent time in prison. We definitely have not been soft on drugs in this country. But at the same time, despite the mandatory minimums associated in long prison sentence for people who are convicted of drug selling, we still are still experiencing a crisis overdose epidemic, right? And while there has definitely been an evolution in thinking about how we respond to drugs since the crack days, as Shaka pointed out, there is now, Sam is saying, yeah, but now district attorneys are saying, let's go back, right? Let's be tougher. Let's use prison more. Why haven't we learned, or what have we learned? And how is it we can avoid this repeat of history, given all the harm that's been caused by the previous approach?
Let me say this, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Shaka, you previously mentioned it. When it was the crack epidemic, we again saw this as a humanitarian crisis that we would use incarceration to solve. So let's put people of color in prisons and jails. And then when it was the opioid epidemic in areas that were not predominantly people of color, we decided we wanted to use treatment. And now we're back in the urban areas where actually fentanyl and some of the drugs are across the country, but we're still saying now that instead of treatment, we should again incarcerate. And I think part of it is like, I believe part of the answer is a more powerful level of true narratives of what's actually happening in our community and how it's happening, so people can see and understand that treatment works and incarceration doesn't, and see the ramifications of that on not just our communities, but our families, our children, our grandparents, like literally we're taking away families for an illness. We're taking away members of families for an illness that should be treated, not with incarceration, but with treatment.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think something really terrible happened in the late 80s and early 90s when funding for mental health treatment, all but evaporated. And now what we're dealing with is people who are self-medicating, people who aren't getting the treatment and support. And Sam can attest to this as well. When I was in solitary confinement, over the course of 7 years, what I saw was high levels of people who had real mental health challenges that were untreated. And these are the same people that we're navigating now when we look at what's happening with housing insecurity. We're looking at the correlation between people in the military returning and having nowhere to turn to, so they end up turning to self-medication. And so I just think that the stories that are being told, we're leaning too heavily into politicians telling those stories. And oftentimes they're going to tell them with their best interests in mind. If you can make people afraid, they'll vote for you. And that's historically been the narrative. And I think we have the greatest opportunity now because we do have our own media channels. We have social media and we have these other outlets, but it takes courage. It takes, courage and leadership. One of the things that I'm not sure if Sam spoke to when he talked about ARC, but one of the things that was my proudest moment of being there is realizing that the majority of my staff was system impacted. And they were able to lead that work in a way that someone who had never been in the system just couldn't, because you can't tell those stories of the dehumanization that takes place in there, the abuses that take place, and the lack of resources to prepare you for life after prison. I wish I would have had a hope and redemption team when I was going through my journey. I'm sure it would have saved me a lot of heartbreak and pain and suffering. And so I think really putting the power of storytelling into the hands of those who are most impacted is really one of the steps that we can take to shift that narrative. The other thing is, like, with research, how are we even, going about the people that we're researching? So again, aligning with system impacted people is a lot more helpful. And I think that's one of the powers that the Censusing Project has, is that you're really leaning into this idea that proximity really does matter. And I think the same for politicians. When we were able to get some of that legislation passed, we brought people proximate to the White House. I'll never forget, I was actually invited to the White House, and on my way in, I was disinvited because I had a felony, even though they were in there talking about reforming the criminal justice system. And luckily, Van Jones was on the stage and he just called the White House out. And they, ended up rushing outside to bring me in. And at that time, they shifted the policy and saying we wouldn't bar people who were system impacted, no matter what the felony was. And then they rolled that back. So, there's this kind of topsy-turvy way that these things are approached. And what we're trying to do is get to consistency so that we can create a groundswell of support that shifts the narrative permanently into where we're actually thinking about people as human beings and not statistic and data.
Excellent. Thank you. I mean, to sort of continue on that thread of like centering people who are directly impacted and their leadership and their storytelling and their experiences. We're in election year. I mean, Sam talked about this too. Voting is important. It's a principle that we at the Sentencing Project prioritize, creating a stronger, more inclusive democracy. And that means expanding access to the ballot box, including for people who are who have previously been banned or prevented from voting because of their felony convictions. What role do you think, voting plays in setting policy agenda around criminal legal reform?
Wow, that's voting is your voice in this country. If you don't vote, or you can't vote, you've been silenced, or you've accepted being silenced. And so, in terms of when we're here in California, one of the things that we say is we elect our champions that will fight for us because they're our voice in the state legislature. And so, voting is our way of being able to speak, because when we want to be able to have expungement for felonies, when we want to be able to have Miranda rights for juveniles, when we want to be able to have in life without the possibility of parole for juveniles, we need our state legislature to stand behind us or beside us and vote the way we want them to vote for a better community. And so the way that we do that is we vote them in and we support them. And when it's time for re-election, we show up because they are our voices and our votes are our voices. And so I think it's hugely important to understand both the significance today, but the historical significance. Like thinking about like Georgia, I remember it. You can't give a person a bottle of water in sweltering heat. Why? A simple question that like you would give that to anyone to be able to quench their thirst while they're standing there in line. Why would we not want to do that? And so those questions is when I have friends of mine that are don't believe their votes matter or count, I ask them this simple question: and why are people trying to stop you from being able to vote?
Yeah, that's power. What I would add to that is that there has to be an educational shift around the power and impact of voting. If you think about, a lot of us go into prison very young, and then we come out middle-aged and adults and voting age. And when you're in prison, you're not getting, a lot of information around why your vote actually matters. And then the American public isn't quite aware of the different ways. I mean, we have over 50 different systems. So when I got paroled out of Michigan, I can vote immediately. Whereas in California, prior to policies being changed, you couldn't vote once you were released, even though you are forced to pay taxes. So I think there's a lot of things that the American public needs to be informed with, but also I think organizations have a great opportunity to become educational allies in terms of educating people why they are incarcerated so that they'll know the power and impact of their vote. I think a lot of emphasis gets put on the national election, and a lot of times we're not thinking about local election and how that impacts everyday life, the way that we experience it. And then lastly, I would say, one of the largest voting blocks in America are system impacted people who have felonies. And I think legislators would do themselves justice to actually hear from us and what really matters to us. And, how are we thinking about our second chance in life and where does voting, apply in that way? And so I just think there's tons of narrative work to do there, but also tons of educational work.
There's a data point around this issue of voting that I love, and I just feel like I should share is, in the last few years, the Cook County Jail in Chicago was made a polling place where people vote in while incarcerated there in person, not just through the mail. And voter turnout during a recent primary exceeded voting in the general population. And I just think that is a huge testament to the interest and the commitment and the understanding of why voting matters, and including with people who are currently incarcerated. It matters and it makes a difference, and they'll show up if they're given access. And that's what's so also crucial, is that people not just get the right to vote, which is important, but that they also be able to access their rights. And at the Sentencing Project, that's something also we're looking at and working really hard to ensure. So thanks for that. So we're coming to an end, but I wanted to ask one final question, which is, what gives you joy? What fuels you to wake up every morning and take on this fight and continue to persevere? What gives you joy? What motivates you?
I'll follow you, Shaka, because I know one of the things that gives you joy is that amazing son of yours. But let me not steal your thunder.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. So there's a couple of things. One, obviously, just being a father is my father and and a husband and a family man. That's where I find my joy is at home with my loved ones. But in terms of this work, what brings me the greatest sense of joy is knowing that the stories I write are awakening people to what's possible for themselves and what's possible for the systems that we have to navigate. You know, for over 10 years now, I get a message every day from someone who's read something that I've written. And just to see people, you know, their awareness and their empathy and the compassion, that brings me the greatest sense of joy. And then outside of that is reading all these lovely books you see in the background. And I don't know if you can see, I actually have a record player, so music. And I think that's an important part of rehabilitation, is being able to lean into the things that makes life fun. So writing, music, and the family and people.
For me, it's definitely family. I have grandchildren now, so I have a grandson that's 5 and one that's 16, and a granddaughter that's 12. And so spending time with them, but also my wife, my mom, who is a cancer survivor, spending a quarter of a century in prison and being able to come home, and her being able to see, my mom being able to see that she did raise a good person. And so being able to spend time with them, and then ride my motorcycle. I ride a Harley Davidson along with my wife, riding together with her. We've ridden to every single prison in California, which is over 4,400 miles. And so, and the other thing is the work, seeing young people thrive after we help them navigate this system. And so I always tell my staff, there are 2 different ways to approach work. You can get up in the morning and say, I have to get up and I have to go to work. I don't look at it that way. I get up and I get to go to work, and I find joy in that, to be able to change this system.
Yeah.
Thank you. That is just amazing. Thank you, both of you. This conversation has given me joy because it fuels my soul and allows me to keep going, knowing that I am part of a larger community, and the Sensing Project is part of a larger community of activists and mobilizers and rebel rousers who are working as hard as they can to end mass incarceration. And those stories just lift me up. So thank you. Thank you for letting me be part of this conversation. Congratulations on receiving this award, and for all the good work that you do and the contributions you make. I'm so, so grateful. I want to thank you. I want to thank the Sensing Project staff, Morgan McLeod, who is our Director of Communications and orchestrated this entire event. And I want to thank the Board of Directors of the Sensing Project for creating this award and making this event possible. So and I want to thank the audience as well for being here, for showing up for Shaka and Sam. The love for you all is clear in the chat. So thank you all for participating and being part of this community with us.
Well,
Have a
thank you
great
so
day,
much.
everybody.
Thank
Thank
you,
you so
everyone.
much for your leadership, Kara.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kara. Appreciate you. Sensing Project, Shaka. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks, y'all.
All right.